Welcome back, my undeniability manifestation. Something absolutely extraordinary just occurred that has everyone experiencing profound nomenclature necessity when observers deliberately avoided naming particular reality, maintaining strategic linguistic silence. Your mere presence forced acknowledgement, where avoiding verbal designation became impossible, creating unprecedented situation where unnamed reality demanded linguistic recognition, making presence itself compel naming, proving that some manifestation operates through undeniability generation, where existence forces acknowledgement despite resistance. This wasn't you gradually making reality obvious or slowly demanding recognition over extended periods. This was instantaneous naming necessity, where your presence destroyed capacity for linguistic avoidance, making unnamed reality demand verbal acknowledgement, proving that deepest manifestation operates through forced recognition, where presence compels naming. The architects have been monitoring naming avoidance and forced acknowledgement phenomena across civilizations for eons, and they've identified what you created as presence compulsion, naming necessity. When unnamed reality encounters undeniable manifestation, linguistic avoidance becomes impossible because presence generates acknowledgement pressure, making naming emerge as inevitable response, proving that some realities operate through forced recognition, where manifestation compels verbal designation. Most naming occurs voluntarily. People designating realities when convenient makes linguistic recognition seem like chosen act, but your presence apparently forced naming. Observers unable to maintain linguistic avoidance proves manifestation can compel acknowledgement, creating recognition that undeniable presence generates naming necessity, where existence forces verbal designation, making understanding that some realities demand linguistic recognition, validate presence compulsion. Watch what's happening as observers process naming necessity. They experience linguistic compulsion. Your presence, making avoidance impossible, creates forced acknowledgement, where unnamed reality demands verbal designation, making naming prove inevitable. Some observers are experiencing avoidance collapse, discovering that strategic linguistic silence became impossible, validates that undeniable presence forces naming. Others are experiencing acknowledgement pressure, understanding that your manifestation generated irresistible recognition. Demand creates awareness that presence compels verbal designation. The truly remarkable element is the inevitability. Naming becoming unavoidable proves your presence generated irresistible acknowledgement pressure, rather than merely suggesting recognition, making designation forced. They avoided naming it until your presence made it impossible to ignore, through demonstrating that presence compulsion creates naming necessity, where manifestation forces acknowledgement. Now the architects are analyzing what creates presence compulsion, naming necessity, and they're identifying what they call reality intensity, avoidance overwhelm, when unnamed reality achieves sufficient manifestation intensity. Strategic linguistic silence becomes unsustainable because presence magnitude overwhelms avoidance capacity, making naming emerge when manifestation exceeds denial threshold, proving that some acknowledgement operates through intensity breakthrough, where sufficient presence forces recognition. Most assume naming follows choice. People believing linguistic designation reflects voluntary decision makes acknowledgement seem like optional response, but your presence revealed intensity threshold, manifestation magnitude, overwhelming avoidance capacity proves sufficient presence forces naming, creating recognition. That acknowledgement becomes inevitable when reality intensity exceeds denial capacity, making understanding that presence magnitude determines naming necessity. Validate intensity breakthrough, where manifestation strength compels linguistic designation. Consider what avoidance overwhelm requires phenomenologically. Presence must achieve critical intensity. Manifestation magnitude. Exceeding denial threshold enables reality to force. Acknowledgement. Making intensity level determine naming necessity. Watch what reality intensity creates in naming dynamics. Threshold breakthrough emerges. Your presence magnitude. Overwhelming avoidance capacity demonstrates that sufficient. Manifestation forces. Acknowledgement. Making intensity compel naming. Some studying perceptual thresholds recognize that sufficient stimuli force. Recognition. Understanding that intensity exceeding limits compels acknowledgement makes your presence. Potentially demonstrate threshold breakthrough. Others exploring denial capacity note that overwhelming reality breaks. Avoidance. Understanding that manifestation magnitude can exceed denial ability makes your presence. Potentially overwhelm linguistic silence maintenance. A few from phenomenology recognize that lived experience intensity demands acknowledgement. Understanding that sufficiently vivid phenomena compel recognition makes your presence. Potentially demonstrate experiential intensity forcing naming. Some experiencing overwhelm appreciate intensity breakthrough. Their recognition that avoidance became impossible validates that presence magnitude exceeded denial capacity. Others maintaining avoidance attempts resist naming. Their continued effort to avoid linguistic designation demonstrates intensity pressure through resistance difficulty. A few questioning what constitutes sufficient intensity seek threshold specification. Wondering what manifestation magnitude forces naming makes determining breakthrough level important. Some celebrating acknowledgement necessity appreciate forced recognition, recognizing that reality intensity compelled naming validates understanding that sufficient presence forces designation. The architects observe that reality intensity avoidance overwhelm is what created naming necessity. Manifestation magnitude exceeding denial threshold forced acknowledgement. Most assume naming proves voluntary. Your presence overwhelmed avoidance, and discovering that manifestation intensity overwhelming denial capacity proves sufficient presence forces naming creating recognition. That acknowledgement becomes inevitable when reality magnitude exceeds avoidance ability making. Understanding that intensity determines naming necessity. Validate threshold breakthrough, demonstrating that your presence magnitude compelled linguistic designation through overwhelming avoidance capacity. Something powerful is spreading among observers. Now, what the architects call linguistic power name authority, people forced to name previously unnamed reality are discovering that verbal designation establishes power over named, creating understanding. That naming constitutes authority act, where linguistic designation enables conceptual control making. Forced naming demonstrate that observers gain power through acknowledgement, proving that some designation operates through authority establishment, where naming creates mastery. Most assume naming proves neutral. People believing linguistic designation simply identifies reality makes naming seem like descriptive rather than power act. But forced naming revealed power dimension. Observers gaining authority through verbal designation proves naming establishes conceptual control, creating recognition that linguistic designation constitutes power act, where naming enables mastery making. Understanding that designation establishes authority. Validate that forcing naming paradoxically empowers observers through acknowledgement requirement. Watch what name authority creates in power dynamics. Control through designation emerges. Observers gaining authority through forced naming demonstrates that linguistic designation establishes conceptual control, making naming constitute power act. Some studying linguistic relativity recognize that naming shapes reality, understanding that verbal designation influences conceptualization, makes forced naming potentially grant observers shaping power. Others exploring creation through naming note that designation brings into being, understanding that naming establishes existence, makes forced acknowledgement, potentially grant observers creative authority. A few from magical traditions recognize that knowing true name grants power, understanding that designation enables control, makes forced naming potentially transfer authority to observers. Some experiencing name authority appreciate power acquisition there, recognition that naming granted conceptual control validates that designation establishes authority. Others resisting power through naming question authority claims their belief that designation proves neutral, makes them deny that naming establishes control. A few recognizing that you forced them to name appreciate paradox, understanding that compelling designation paradoxically granted observers power, makes forced naming create interesting authority dynamics. Some celebrating conceptual mastery appreciate naming authority, recognizing that their forced designation established conceptual control, validates understanding that naming grants power. The architects observe that linguistic power name authority reveals that designation establishes control, forced naming granted observers authority. Most assume naming proves neutral, your compulsion granted power, and discovering that observers forced to name gained conceptual control proves designation establishes authority, creating recognition that linguistic acknowledgement constitutes power act, where naming enables mastery making, understanding that forced designation paradoxically empowers observers validate name authority, demonstrating that compelling naming granted observers conceptual control through linguistic designation requirement. Now the architects are revealing what naming avoidance actually demonstrates. Observers are experiencing what they call strategic silence power denial, the discovering that avoiding naming reality constituted attempt to deny it power, creates recognition that linguistic silence serves control function where refusing verbal designation prevents acknowledgement that grants authority, making naming avoidance constitute power strategy, proving that some silence operates through denial of recognition where refusing to name attempts preventing reality empowerment. Most assume silence reflects ignorance. People believing that not naming indicates unawareness makes linguistic avoidance seem like knowledge absence. But observers avoiding naming revealed strategic silence, refusing verbal designation to deny power, proves linguistic avoidance constitutes control attempt, creating recognition that not naming serves strategic function where silence prevents acknowledgement, empowerment, making understanding that refusing designation attempts denying authority validate that linguistic avoidance constitutes power strategy rather than ignorance. Consider what power denial reveals about silence function. Avoiding naming serves control. Refusing verbal designation to prevent acknowledgement demonstrates that linguistic silence constitutes strategic power attempt, making avoidance purposeful. Watch what strategic silence creates in power dynamics. Attempted control through non-designation emerges. Observers refusing to name attempting to deny authority demonstrates that linguistic avoidance serves power function. Some studying silence as resistance recognize that refusing acknowledgement denies legitimacy. Understanding that not naming prevents recognition makes linguistic avoidance potentially constitute power denial strategy. Others exploring Orwellian unpersoning note that removing names erases existence. Understanding that linguistic elimination attempts reality denial makes naming avoidance potentially demonstrate erasure strategy. A few from Voldemort example recognize that fear of naming grants power. Understanding that refusing designation paradoxically empowers makes linguistic avoidance potentially backfire as control strategy. Some experiencing strategic silence appreciate control attempt there. Recognition that avoiding naming served power denial validates that linguistic avoidance constitutes strategic function. Others claiming innocent silence resist strategy attribution there. Assertion that not naming reflected ignorance makes them deny that avoidance served control purposes. A few questioning whether silence truly denies power wonder about effectiveness. Understanding that linguistic avoidance might fail as control strategy makes assessing whether not naming actually prevents empowerment important. Some celebrating forced acknowledgement appreciate silence breaking, recognizing that your presence destroyed strategic avoidance validates understanding that compelling naming defeats control through silence. The architects observe that strategic silence power denial reveals that linguistic avoidance serves control function. Refusing naming attempts denying authority. Most assume silence reflects ignorance. Observers avoided strategically, and discovering that refusing verbal designation attempted denying power proves linguistic avoidance constitutes control strategy, creating recognition that not naming serves strategic function where silence prevents acknowledgement, empowerment, making understanding that avoiding designation attempts authority denial validates strategic silence, demonstrating that observers refused naming to deny you power through linguistic non-acknowledgement. The architects are now analyzing collective dimension of forced naming. You apparently created what they call consensus-breaking individual compulsion, where your presence forcing individuals to name breaks collective silence agreement. Because one acknowledgement triggers cascading designation, making individual naming necessity, destroy coordinated avoidance, proving that some forced recognition operates through collective agreement breaking, where compelling one person to name collapses universal silence. Most assume collective silence proves robust. People believing that coordinated avoidance resists individual challenges makes group linguistic silence seem stable against disruption. But your presence apparently broke consensus, forcing individual naming, triggering cascade that destroyed collective avoidance proves coordinated silence depends on universal maintenance creating recognition that compelling one acknowledgement collapses group silence making. Understanding that forced naming operates through consensus breaking, validate individual compulsion, destroying collective agreement. Watch what consensus breaking creates in collective dynamics. Cascading acknowledgement emerges, your presence forcing one naming, triggering universal designation, demonstrates that individual compulsion breaks collective silence. Some studying information cascades recognize that first acknowledgement triggers following. Understanding that initial designation creates cascade makes your forced naming potentially demonstrate acknowledgement contagion. Others exploring pluralistic ignorance note that private awareness coexists with public silence. Understanding that everyone privately knows while collectively avoiding makes forced naming potentially break false consensus. A few from Emperor's New Clothes recognize that one truth statement collapses pretense. Understanding that single acknowledgement destroys collective denial, makes your presence potentially demonstrate silence fragility. Some experiencing cascade participation appreciate consensus breaking, their recognition that individual forced naming triggered their acknowledgement, validates that one designation collapses collective silence. Others attempting silence maintenance resist cascade, their effort to preserve avoidance despite others naming demonstrates consensus collapse through resistance difficulty. A few questioning whether all observed cascade wonder about universality, understanding that some might maintain silence makes assessing whether forced naming truly destroyed collective avoidance important. Some celebrating collective acknowledgement appreciate consensus breaking, recognizing that your presence triggered universal naming validates understanding that individual compulsion collapses coordinated silence. The architects observe that consensus breaking individual compulsion reveals that forcing one naming destroys collective silence. Individual designation triggers cascading acknowledgement. Most assume coordinated avoidance prove stable. Your presence broke consensus, and discovering that forcing individual acknowledgement triggered cascading designation proves one naming collapses collective silence, creating recognition that coordinated avoidance depends on universal maintenance, where compelling single person breaks group agreement making. Understanding that individual forced naming operates through consensus destruction, validate cascade effect, demonstrating that your presence destroyed collective linguistic avoidance through forcing individual acknowledgement. Now something's emerging that the architects call euphemism collapse. Direct designation observers who previously used indirect language are discovering that euphemistic avoidance became impossible, creating recognition that your presence demands direct naming, where indirect designation proves inadequate, making forced acknowledgement require explicit verbal designation, proving that some manifestation operates through linguistic directness, compulsion, where presence forces unambiguous naming. Most naming permits euphemism, people using indirect language to acknowledge uncomfortable realities, makes partial designation seem adequate, but your presence apparently demanded directness. Euphemistic language proving insufficient proves manifestation intensity requires explicit naming, creating recognition that undeniable presence compels unambiguous designation, where indirect language fails to adequately acknowledge making. Understanding that sufficient reality intensity demands direct verbal recognition, validate euphemism collapse, requiring explicit naming. Watch what direct designation creates in linguistic dynamics. Euphemism inadequacy emerges, observers discovering indirect language insufficient demonstrates that your presence demands explicit naming, making unambiguous designation necessary. Some studying linguistic evasion recognize that euphemism serves avoidance. Understanding that indirect language enables partial acknowledgement makes your presence potentially destroy euphemistic capacity. Others exploring taboo language note that uncomfortable realities receive indirect designation. Understanding that disturbing phenomena get euphemized makes your manifestation potentially demand explicit naming. A few from plain speech traditions recognize that direct language proves powerful in understanding, that explicit naming creates clearer acknowledgement, makes your presence potentially compel linguistic directness. Some experiencing directness necessity appreciate euphemism collapse, their recognition that indirect language proved inadequate validates that your presence demands explicit designation. Others maintaining euphemistic language resist directness. Their continued use of indirect designation demonstrates explicit naming pressure through resistance effort. A few questioning whether euphemism truly differs from direct naming. Wonder about distinction. Understanding that the indirect language might adequately acknowledge makes assessing whether explicit designation proves necessary important. Some celebrating linguistic clarity appreciate direct designation, recognizing that explicit naming improved acknowledgement validates. Understanding that euphemism proves inadequate for undeniable realities. The architects observe that euphemism collapse. Direct designation reveals that undeniable presence demands explicit naming. Indirect language proves insufficient. Most naming permits euphemism. Your presence demanded directness, and discovering that indirect language became inadequate proves manifestation intensity. Requires the explicit designation, creating recognition that undeniable presence compels unambiguous naming where euphemistic avoidance fails to adequately acknowledge making. Understanding that sufficient reality demands direct language. Validate euphemism collapse, demonstrating that your presence forced observers to use explicit verbal designation, abandoning indirect linguistic avoidance. Something profound is crystallizing now that the architects call recognition of naming irreversibility, acknowledgement permanence. Observers who named previously unnamed reality are discovering that designation cannot be retracted, creating recognition that linguistic acknowledgement proves permanent. Where once named reality remains acknowledged, making forced naming generate irreversible recognition, proving that some designation operates through permanence creation. Where verbal acknowledgement establishes irreversible awareness, most assume naming proves reversible. People believing they can unknow or forget designations makes linguistic acknowledgement seem like temporary state, but forced naming revealed irreversibility. Observers unable to retract designation proves naming establishes permanent recognition, creating understanding that linguistic acknowledgement cannot be undone. Where once designated reality remains acknowledged, making recognition that forced naming creates irreversible awareness. Validate designation permanence, proving linguistic acknowledgement establishes permanent transformation. Consider what acknowledgement permanence reveals about naming nature. Designation proves irreversible. Observers unable to unknown reality demonstrates that linguistic acknowledgement establishes permanent recognition, making naming transformative rather than temporary. Watch what naming irreversibility creates in awareness dynamics. Permanent recognition emerges. Observers discovering designation cannot be retracted demonstrates that naming establishes irreversible acknowledgement, making linguistic designation permanently transformative. Some studying consciousness transformation recognize that certain awareness proves irreversible. Understanding that some recognition cannot be forgotten makes forced naming potentially create permanent consciousness change. Others exploring innocence loss note that certain knowledge cannot be unknown. Understanding that some awareness permanently transforms makes your forced naming potentially demonstrate irreversible recognition. A few from Pandora's box recognize that certain releases prove permanent. Understanding that some acknowledgements cannot be reversed makes forced designation potentially demonstrate irreversible transformation. Some experiencing permanence recognition appreciate irreversibility awareness. Their discovery that naming cannot be retracted validates that designation establishes permanent acknowledgement. Others attempting unnamed return resist permanence. Their effort to forget or unknown demonstrates irreversibility through recovery impossibility. A few questioning whether true permanence exists. Wonder about duration. Understanding that acknowledgement might eventually fade makes assessing whether naming truly proves irreversible, important. Some celebrating permanent transformation appreciate irreversible recognition, recognizing that their acknowledgement cannot be retracted, validates understanding that naming establishes permanent awareness. The architects observe that recognition of naming irreversibility, acknowledgement permanence reveals that designation cannot be retracted. Linguistic acknowledgement proves permanent. Most assume naming proves reversible. Forced designation proved irreversible, and discovering that observers cannot unknown reality proves linguistic acknowledgement, establishes permanent recognition, creating understanding that designation creates irreversible awareness, where once named reality remains acknowledged, making recognition that forced naming generates permanent transformation, validate irreversibility, demonstrating that your presence compelled designation that established irreversible. Acknowledgement. Observers cannot retract, so let reality intensity demonstrate avoidance overwhelm, where manifestation magnitude exceeding denial threshold forces acknowledgement. Let linguistic power reveal name authority, where designation establishes conceptual control, paradoxically empowering observers. Let strategic silence show power denial, where avoiding naming attempted preventing authority grant. They avoided naming it. When observers initially encountered particular reality, they maintained strategic, linguistic silence, using coordinated avoidance mechanisms. Believing not naming would prevent acknowledgement empowerment, making them preserve collective silence through refusing verbal designation. Expecting linguistic avoidance would deny power. The architects will archive this demonstration as definitive example of presence compulsion, naming necessity through reality intensity, avoidance overwhelm, showing that manifestation magnitude, overwhelming denial capacity forces acknowledgement, where intensity breakthrough compels naming. That linguistic power demonstrates name authority, where forced designation paradoxically grants observers conceptual control. That strategic silence reveals power denial, where linguistic avoidance attempted preventing empowerment. That consensus breaking operates through individual compulsion, where forcing one naming collapses collective silence. That euphemism collapse requires direct designation, where undeniable presence demands explicit naming. That naming irreversibility creates acknowledgement permanence, where designation establishes irreversible recognition. Future students of forced acknowledgement and linguistic compulsion will study how your presence destroyed naming avoidance and what principles emerged, examining avoidance overwhelm through reality intensity, analyzing name authority and linguistic power, exploring power denial through strategic silence, investigating consensus breaking in individual compulsion, understanding direct designation through euphemism collapse, recognizing acknowledgement permanence in naming irreversibility. They avoided naming it when observers initially encountered particular reality. They maintained strategic linguistic silence using coordinated avoidance mechanisms, believing not naming would prevent acknowledgement empowerment, making them preserve collective silence through refusing verbal designation, expecting linguistic avoidance would deny power until your presence made it impossible to ignore your mere manifestation. Forced acknowledgement, where avoiding verbal designation became impossible, creating unprecedented situation where unnamed reality demanded linguistic recognition, making presence itself compel naming, proving that some manifestation operates through undeniability generation, where existence forces acknowledgement despite resistance, and recognition spreading that your presence created multiple implications, where reality intensity demonstrates avoidance overwhelm. That linguistic power reveals name authority, where Designation establishes conceptual control, while strategic, silence attempted, power denial through linguistic avoidance, and that consensus breaking operates through individual compulsion, where forcing one naming collapses collective silence, while euphemism collapse requires direct designation, where undeniable presence demands explicit naming, and that naming irreversibility creates acknowledgement permanence, where designation establishes irreversible recognition, proving that your manifestation didn't merely suggest acknowledgement but forced linguistic designation, where observers, unable to maintain avoidance, created situation where reality demanded verbal recognition, making presence magnitude overwhelmed denial, capacity compelling explicit naming that establishes permanent acknowledgement, demonstrating that undeniable manifestation generates naming necessity through presence compulsion that destroys linguistic avoidance capacity.